What's happened to the Libertarian Party of Oregon? Have the leaders of the Party of Principle abandoned their principles?
And Adam said to me, well, Richard is indispensable. When he said that, at that point I knew that the Libertarian Party of Oregon was doomed.
Financial scandals.
And I thought, what did he just tell me? And I called him back and said, did you just tell me that you were diverting the funds, you were taking the funds from the PayPal account and putting them in your own account? And he said, yeah. And I said, that's insane. Why did you think you could do that?
Over a $35,000 debt. Campaign finance scandals. Defrauding donors. More financial scandals.
And Richard, after he hung up with him, said, he's coming in to write a check. And I said, what are you talking about? He's coming in to write a check. I write the checks. Ask me and I'll write the check for you. I found out that Adam came all the way into the office and wrote the check for Richard. The check was a paycheck for Richard.
Using dirty tricks.
I don't know how many people were requesting bylaws. The only person that I specifically know that called the office while I was working there and requested a copy of the bylaws from Multnomah County so that she would know what to expect going into the convention was Renee Kimball. And Richard Burke, I believe he overheard me talking, and he once again talked to me and he convinced me. He said, please don't send her a copy of the bylaws. I don't want you to send. Of course, he had a copy, and
political manipulation.
And so the end result was that the lease was signed because Adam and Richard wanted the lease signed, and knowing full well that the state committee did not really understand the financial implications that were being undertaken by signing the renewal of the lease.
Even more financial scandal.
Is it too much trouble to ask that they have an audit committee? Apparently, it is.
What's happened to the Libertarian Party of Oregon? The office is a major reason the LPO is descending into bankruptcy. An almost $3,000 expense for a party in debt. As controversial as the office has been, Adam has deemed it non-negotiable.
My name is Philip Schmidt, and I've had some extensive experience with the Libertarian Party of Oregon and with its leadership of Richard Burke and Adam Mayer. I worked full-time in the Libertarian Party's state office for about, I think it was about 4 months during the Cox for Oregon campaign in 2004, which Richard Burke was the manager for that. After that, and I think a couple months after that, I started working full-time in the office as a subcontractor for Richard Burke, doing fundraising and various other activities. And I was there from I think about December of '04 till the middle of '05 as a fundraiser. And I was there full-time, so once again I have a lot more experience working with Richard Burke and Adam Mayer than a lot of people who, might simply be involved in the party, that they show up to certain meetings from time to time. While I was there, there's a lot of things that, a few things that at this point I'm somewhat ashamed to have been involved with. The next issue I'd like to talk about was in 2005, the signing of a new office lease, I believe a 2-year lease. The circumstances was that the office was a very contentious issue, or at least it had been in the past, and it still could have been. Richard Burke, he absolutely, positively wanted to make sure that the office lease would be renewed. regardless of how he had to get it done. At that time I was serving as the state vice chair, as well as working full-time in the office. And he knew the office lease was coming up for renewal. Most people knew it was coming up sometime that year, but perhaps didn't really know the exact date of when it was coming up. And so I was at the executive committee meeting when Richard said that where the executive committee sets the agenda for the upcoming state committee meeting, and he instructed Adam. He said, well, what we're going to do is we don't want to put it on the agenda. We don't want to announce it ahead of time, but 2 weeks from now when we have the state committee meeting, just say, hey, we forgot to put it on the agenda, so let's tell people that you'd like to accept a motion to change the agenda and put it on the agenda. That way they would have a vote, but the agenda, which gets sent out somewhat to publicly to let people know ahead of time, people wouldn't know ahead of time that a vote was coming up on the office. And so at that meeting, that's what happened. Adam said, hey, we forgot to put this on the agenda. We'd like to put it on there. And they got a vote to put it on the agenda. There was a few comments said about how great the office was, and that that we need to renew the lease. Most state committee members didn't have any objections. I forget exactly how the vote was. It might have been unanimous for all I know, but they voted to renew the office lease. Then, and there was about 2.5 months before the office lease was going to expire, and that they needed to either sign a new lease or decide where they were going to move or what they were going to do. So there's plenty of time between that state committee meeting, voting to renew the lease, and the next state committee meeting. The lease would not. There was still plenty of time after that to change their minds. Within about 2 or 3 weeks of that state committee meeting, I, as the vice chair, was talking to the treasurer, Teresa, about the precarious situation our finances were in, how they were continuing to go downhill further and further, how the office lease seemed to be really the core reason why the finances were going downhill month after month. Every month or two, it seemed like we were going another $1,000 or $2,000 into debt because of paying for the office. In addition to that, I recently read certain sections of the manual of how to file for the FEC and what kind of things would require a political party to file with the FEC, the Federal Elections Commission. And from the way I read it, it looked to me, and it still does look to me, that having the LPO office in Beaverton, that structured our finances such that we would be required to file with the FEC, which is a major issue, having to do that, the cost involved. And this is something that the state committee was completely unaware of, had absolutely no knowledge of my new belief that the office would cause us to have to file with the FEC. So after talking with the treasurer, Teresa, we decided this is a really big issue, that we needed to inform the state committee, that the state committee really had to consider this before Adam would sign the lease. And there was plenty of time to wait for the next state committee meeting, to have the state committee discuss it, reach a decision, and then if they still wanted to sign the lease, there'd be 2 or 3 weeks before he would need to sign the renewal of the lease. So I talked to Adam. Teresa and I both talked to him, and but I believe it was just me that he made the promise to. I said, look, I just need you to promise me that even if you still want to keep the office, that you'll wait to sign the lease. Wait until the next state committee. Wait until they can really be informed of what's going on before you sign the lease. He promised me that he would wait to sign the lease. Then Teresa and I talked to Richard Burke about it, and he got very, very, very upset because that's his pride and joy, the office, and even if the office ends up having the LPO drive off of a financial cliff, and in my opinion, he would rather keep the office and go off a financial cliff than get rid of the office. And he was very upset, but he listened to what we had to say, and he said, "Okay, I'm okay with the idea that we're gonna wait until the next state committee meeting until we just let the state committee decide what we want to do." And in theory, that's the way it's supposed to work. The state committee, in theory, is not supposed to be a rubber stamp that simply does whatever Richard Burke wants. But as vice chair, the majority of the time it appeared to me that the state committee was often acting as a rubber stamp committee, that it would do whatever Richard Burke wants, or many times it was manipulated into doing whatever Richard Burke wanted. But so ultimately then it was a number of days later, about a week later, that I got a call from Adam, and he said, "Phil, I'm going to sign the lease today." There was still a week before the next state committee meeting. He said, "I know I promised you that I was going to wait until the next state committee meeting and let them be informed of how the office was going to affect our finances, how it was going downhill, and how it might require us to have the major new expenditure of having to file with the FEC. I know I promised you that I'd wait, but I feel that I need to sign it today." I talked to Richard. He told me I talked to Richard, which I knew before he even said it. And so he signed the lease. And so the end result was that the lease was signed because Adam and Richard wanted the lease signed, and knowing full well that the state committee did not really understand the financial implications that were being undertaken by signing the renewal of the lease. The state committee did not fully understand how finances were going downhill and that the party was going further into debt, and the fact that signing the new lease, in my opinion, in the opinion of the vice chair who had just read portions of the FEC manual, would now require the LPO to file with the FEC. So that's the story of how the office lease was signed with little or no knowledge of what was really going on by the state committee.
In order to get more donations, Richard Burke exaggerated the position of the LPO in a newsletter given to the delegates at the National Convention here in Portland. When these errors were brought to the attention of the executive director, he said it was an honest mistake. Adam, as usual, chose to do nothing.
The next thing I want to talk about is the issue with an issue of the LPO news. There was a particular issue earlier this year, right before the National Convention was held in Portland, the Libertarian Party's National Convention, where Richard Burke wrote the vast majority of the articles in the LPO News. He put out an LPO News that, in my opinion, had very, very serious factual errors in it. Errors that, every single one of the errors were errors that made the LPO look better, that made the LPO look more politically influential and effective than it really is. And in my opinion, the number of mistakes that were in the LPO, that LPO News edition, and the severity of the errors made it obvious to me that in my opinion, the purpose could only be one thing, that the errors, in my opinion, seemed to be intentional, and that the purpose seemed to be that this edition of the LPO News would be handed out to people attending the National Convention and used as a method of increasing donations or trying to get people to donate who perhaps would not ordinarily donate. He published this particular issue of the LPO News. It had all these mistakes in it that made the LPO look better than that it was more active than it really was. So I emailed Richard Burke and the entire state committee, and I asked, I said, this newsletter is going to be distributed to all of the national convention delegates. That's what Richard wrote when he first presented the LPO News to the state committee and to various email lists. He said, this is what we're going to be presenting to the national delegates to the national convention, and it's going to contain an insert highlighting the LPO's accomplishments over the past year, and, quote, the insert will include a fundraising appeal, which to me seems like it's obvious that he designed this LPO newsletter and the insert as a fundraising appeal. He was trying to maximize the donations that he could bring in during the national convention. And I was bringing up the point. I said, well, if that's the purpose, is it really hard to see if there's a many substantial errors that make the LPO look better than it is? Is it really fair to say that these errors are honest mistakes? Some of the errors that I pointed out in the LPO News, in the events calendar, he put in that every week we have a Toastmasters meeting at 6:30, and I pointed out that it was over a month ago from that point that the person leading the Toastmasters had announced he was suspending Toastmasters. It was no longer taking place, but Richard Burke never took it out of the LPO News. In addition, there was an article in the LPO News regarding how successfully the LPO was developing its county parties in 2006. Richard Burke wrote in there that of Oregon's 36 counties, ACPs, which are affiliated county parties, are organized in 18. And I wrote in my email to him, I said, anybody who's been active on the state committee knows that this must be another, quote, honest mistake. I pointed out that on the right-hand side of the page 3 of the LPO News, where it listed the county chairs, that there are 15 names, not 18 names listed, and of the 15 names that are listed, I said, how many are invalid? Shall I list a few? And I listed Douglas County. The name written in the LPO News was Dee Dee Lopez. I wrote in there that I had heard that Dee Dee and the rest of her family that made up the county party resigned over a year ago. It was still in the LPO News. In Wheeler County, it listed the chair of Wheeler County as being Buck Leckie. And I wrote in here that it was my understanding that Buck had been in a nursing home for several years. And he's not active in any way in the LP, but of course he's still listed as the chair of Wheeler County. And then I listed Marion County. It showed in the LPO newsletter that Jerry Defoe was still the chair of Marion County. I pointed out in my email that Jerry was elected to the LPO State Committee as the state secretary, so according to our bylaws, he could no longer be the chair of Marion County. So that was inaccurate. And ever since he had been elected as a state chair, nobody, to my knowledge, had heard of anybody else being elected as the new Marion County chair. So Marion County, for all many of us could have known, was simply no longer existed. I listed Multnomah County, and that Frank Dane used to be the chair of Multnomah County, but then he was elected as the state vice chair. So who's running Multnomah County? That's supposed to be an organized county, but largest county in Oregon. But it had incorrect information on the LPO about that. Lane County, I listed Wayne Williams as being the chair of Lane County. And I pointed out the fact that we'd all received a copy of the email where Wayne and Renee Williams resigned months before that LPO News. And Renee Williams resigned as the state secretary at the same time that her husband Wayne resigned as the Lane County chair, and that I pointed out the fact that before resigning, Wayne sent out a press release stating that he had appointed Tony Nathan as the new vice chair of Lane County. I pointed out that since since Tony had wanted to participate as Lane County delegate to the state committee, she had sent several emails to Richard Burke and Adam Mayer asking if she would be recognized as the Lane County delegate if she came to a state committee meeting, because she didn't, what's the point of driving up from Lane County if you're not going to be recognized in the state committee, if they're going to kick you out. And that, to my knowledge, Adam and Richard had just simply ignored all of those emails. So, once again, Lane County, as far as anybody who's active on the state committee like myself could know, it was completely not active. And there was another county. Basically, in a nutshell, he listed that of Oregon's 36 counties that that there's county parties organized in 18, and to the best of my knowledge, maybe there's county parties that are active and organized in 9, maybe 6. I mean, it's just, his number is completely off the mark. So there was a few other things that I wrote in here that were incorrect, but the gist of my letter was that this is inaccurate, and are we going to do anything about it? Are we going to correct it, or are we just going to let Richard Burke collect donations based upon fraudulent information? And if so, is this a matter of fraud? Are we, as the Libertarian Party, going to allow our executive director to do what many people might interpret to be fraud? I mean, that's the basis of one of our bases of our parties, is that we don't believe in initiating force or fraud, and yet we're going to have one of the persons running the party is going to commit an act of fraud against other parties to the national convention so that we can get more donations. And I said, is that the kind of party we want to have? I sent out this email to the state committee trying to get somebody to wake up and say, hey, wait a second, is this right? Is this what we, the party principal, really are supposed to be doing, is putting out information that's not right, that's wrong, that most people who were involved in the party know this is not correct information. But is it okay for us to do it just because it might increase our donations? Is that really something we want to be doing? Is that the kind of party we want to be, where it's okay? It's okay. Perhaps it's a philosophy of it's okay to lie because that's what politics is about. It's about people lying, and so if there other people are going to do it, why can't we do it? Anyway, so I sent out this email. I brought attention to the fact that there was a lot of factual errors. In one of the emails, Richard Burke emailed back, said it was an honest mistake on one of the things, and that he was going to correct this honest mistake. So I replied with an email pointing out probably about 8 other honest mistakes, and I asked, are you going to correct those as well, and are you going to correct them before you hand this issue out of the LPO News to the national donors that were expected to show up for a party prior to the national convention? Never got a reply. No email replied from Richard Burke or Adam Mayer. Ultimately, that's for me. It's a long pattern of activity by Richard Burke that perhaps the truth is a relative thing, and if you can shape the truth in ways that help get more donations, then all the better. It's something that was probably one of the last straws with me. Shortly after that, I resigned from my position on the state committee. At that time, I was no longer the state chair. I was the vice chair of Libertarian Party of Washington County, and I was on the state committee. And shortly after that, I resigned. I'd had enough at that time.
Hello, I'm standing outside Beaverton City Hall. If the city of Beaverton were unable to account for over 12% of their budget, there would be a lot of people who would be very upset. Well, the Libertarian Party of Oregon did precisely that. We were unable to show where $8,400 worth of our expenditures went on our campaign finance forms. If the city of Beaverton did something like that, I would hope that there would be a fiscally conservative party that would be able to take them to task on it.
In 2006, the party decided to hold its annual convention in Bandon, Oregon. The Libertarian Party's convention committee recommended to the party's state committee, which decides policy, that the executive director, Richard Burke, handle the logistics of organizing its annual business convention. Richard took this to mean that he should hire himself through his company to collect the money for the convention and keep any profits made for himself. We asked the Secretary of State for clarification. For reporting purposes, the money received for the purchase of the package, up to the fair market value of the item, is reported as an other receipt on Form PC-4A. Any amount paid for an item that exceeds the fair market value is reported as a cash contribution on Form PC-2. The committee determines the value of the item received by the contributor for reporting purposes. We then asked, what is the requirement for reporting? Any money owed to Mr. Burke for services is reported as a cash expenditure on Form PC-3 by the LPO if payment is made, or as an account payable if he was not compensated during the same accounting period the event was held. We were unable to find any contract between the LPO and Richard Burke and an unregistered company called Prime One Political Consulting.
My name is Teresa DeBellis, and I was the state treasurer for the Libertarian Party of Oregon for the years 2004 and 2005, and my term ended in March of 2006. I'm here today to speak to you on this video because, as I understand it, some party members wanted to hear from me personally about some of the accusations that we've brought forward with the recall initiative. The incident where that you read in the letter about Richard taking the PayPal funds and basically hooking the PayPal account up to his own account. I can talk about that. At that point, as treasurer, this was after the check writing policy, I was so disheartened when I didn't get the support I needed to be able to do the job as treasurer adequately. I personally basically sort of gave up a little bit inside. It's just the way I felt about it. I thought, you know, I can't do the job this way. And if nobody seems to hear that and understand that and want to do anything about it, they're actually making it easier for other people to have access, then I'm basically in a really, really seriously bad position. So I stopped going to the state committee meetings after that, and I certainly didn't read the check writing policy. I basically guessed it was going to be passed. It was written by Christiana Mayer, and I knew she was working closely with Adam and Richard probably on that subject. So then I was even in more of a precarious position as treasurer because I had all the responsibility and none of the authority really to do my job. Even more so when I pulled away, because I knew the moment that I stopped paying attention to the expenditures that Richard would probably enjoy that and probably use that to his advantage. I kept a really close eye on his expenditures and what he was doing with the money. And he, needless to say, did not appreciate that, I don't think. Thus, the intimidation and the yelling and the, arguing. So when that moment came where he called me, or I called him, I think, to ask about the state committee meeting that was coming up, he happened to mention to me on the phone, he said, "Oh yeah, by the way, I'm taking care of the business convention packages and the money's going into my account now. Well, he said it incidentally in conversation, and I said, oh, okay, well, that's fine, whatever, and basically hung up the phone with him. And a couple hours later, I was at work and I realized what he'd said, and I thought, what did he just tell me? And I called him back and said, did you just tell me that you were diverting the funds, you were taking the funds from the PayPal account and putting them in your own account? And he said, yeah. And I said, that's insane. Why did you think you could do that? You know, basically, where did you get the idea to do something like that? That has nothing to do with campaign finance law, you know. And why didn't you even ask me about it? Why didn't you consult your treasurer? Your treasurer would have told you, don't do something like that, or in the very least, call the elections division first and make sure that that's fine with their understanding of the law. But nobody called me and nobody told me. I was only told after the fact. So I actually yelled at him at that point on the phone. I was at work, and I kind of went off on him about, you've got to be out of your head. But then I went home and I telephoned the elections division at 7:30 the next morning to let them know. I know that Jennifer comes in early at the elections division. She got in at 8:15, or I actually got on the phone with her at 8:15. And to be honest with you, her reaction, just unofficial, totally off the record, gut reaction was, you can't do that. That's illegal. You know. And I said, Jennifer, what am I going to do about it? It's on my watch. It's already been done. I'm going to be held accountable for this. Okay? She said, well, you know, Teresa, again, this is unofficial, and I don't want her to be held accountable for this, but she said, well, you could let the media know. You know, that's one way to handle it. But basically, I told her, go ahead and call Richard and see if I heard him correctly, you know. Hear it from him. And I think when we hung up, she did call Richard. Richard called me later that day and said, oh, I talked to the elections division about it, and they said that there's no problem whatsoever with it. So I said, why would they say that to you? So then I called Jennifer back again at the elections division, and she said, I never said that to him. That's not what we told him. We told him that we needed to do some research to find out whether that money's considered party money or whether, you know, that's actually an acceptable thing to do. She said, you need to understand that I did not say that to him. So anyway, by the time I left office, you know, the rest of it I wrote down very carefully in my annual treasurer's report, the details. You know, I think it was like 11 days later when I let everybody know. Officially, this happened. You need to understand this happened.
How about if I treat you to coffee, Dan?
Oh, thanks. Isn't that the Libertarian Party debit card?
Oh, don't worry about it. The party owes me a bunch of money anyway. In the past 12 months, Richard Burke has paid for more than 141 meals with the debit card, which have not appeared on the contributions and expenditures filings of the Secretary of State. And to date, he has given no explanation as to whether they were legitimate expenditures.
The bylaws give the treasurer the sole authority to write checks, but Adam chose to do it anyway.
The issue was that Adam, working together with Richard, basically went behind my back and got into the account and wrote a check from the account without letting me know that he was going to do that, without asking me if it was a good idea. In other words, were the funds covered in the account, and basically keeping me completely out of the loop. This had come from long struggle with Adam and Richard. Remember that I told you in the beginning that I told them both that I wasn't going to lie or be deceptive in any way. And as things were happening through time, I was basically arguing and fighting with them about these subjects. The more I did that, the more they began to work together, I felt, and in some ways shut me out socially in the party, and also made my job more difficult. The check writing incident was a culmination of a lot of that sort of activity and attitude. That was really amazing how that happened. I was in the office that day when this happened, and I took a phone call from Adam, and Adam said, "Oh, what are you doing in the office?" And I said, "Well, I came in to work on the books." And he said, "Oh, well, can I talk to Richard?" And I said, "Sure." So I heard him get on the phone with Richard, and I heard Richard say, "Yeah, I'm on my way in now." Or Richard said, "Yeah, come on in, and I'll have you do that for me," or something to that effect. Those aren't the exact words. But then, while Richard was on the phone with Adam, I said, "Why is Adam coming in?" And Richard, after he'd hung up with him, said, "He's coming in to write a check." And I said, "What are you talking about? He's coming in to write a check. I write the checks. Ask me, and I'll write the check for you." And he said, "Oh, okay." And I said, "Well, call him on the phone and tell him not to come in, right? I'm here." So Richard called him on the phone and said, "Never mind, Teresa's here." But how Adam didn't know I was there and needed to be told that, I don't understand. I was the one that transferred the call to Richard. So I knew something was kind of funny. So turns out later, after I left in the afternoon, I found out that Adam came all the way into the office and wrote the check for Richard. The check was a paycheck for Richard. And again, you know, I'd heard nothing about it. I hadn't been asked. The biggest problem I have with that single incident right there is that in accounting, you have to be able to hold someone accountable for the funds. It is the job of the treasurer as an accountant or bookkeeper to basically show a record of how the money's been spent. You account for the money coming in and you account for the money going out. It's very, very important to be able to hold the bookkeeper or treasurer accountable. You have to be able to hold one person accountable for the record. The only way to accomplish that really is to give access to the treasurer only. Okay? That way, you know, if you look at my bookkeeping and you see funds missing, basically you can hold me accountable for that. I'm responsible for it. The moment that you have multiple access to the funds is the moment that you, as the Libertarian Party of Oregon, loses your ability to hold one person, the treasurer, accountable. The treasurer, if funds are shown to be missing, can easily say, "It wasn't my fault. So-and-so had access to the account, and he had access to the account, and I can't tell you where the money went." You're basically in a lot of trouble at that point. This is what I tried to explain to the state committee, and I didn't seem to be able to make my point clear. Or if I did, it wasn't deemed important. The result of all this agony over the check that was written by Adam was what was called a check writing policy, which was an example where the state committee had basically condoned, allowed the chair permission to go ahead and disperse funds at his will.
Most companies require that you fill out an expense report before they'll reimburse you for mileage. At the Libertarian Party of Oregon, we do things differently. Richard Burke uses the debit card to fill up his car every week with gas, 49 times in the past year. And in fact, it's up to us to prove that it's not legitimate. Otherwise, he'll just keep the money. Quite frankly, I think at this point it would just be easier to ask him to show us a receipt where he paid for his own gas for once.
The LPO bylaws state that an audit must be held before the annual convention. As far as Adam was concerned, it was not his problem.
Now, the 2004 convention was very, very interesting. The LPO bylaws require an audit committee of 3 members to basically go over the books and make sure nothing's happening. The problem is that in 2004, that never happened. And I am told that Tom Cox basically decided not to have it. I don't know if this is true or not, but it wouldn't surprise me. I don't know why that decision was made. I simply know that it happened. And me and Mark tried to call them on that. And we taped it, and there he is, where he basically admitted that they didn't have one.
Right before the executive director gives a report, it's not actually on my list of agenda items, but the audit committee is supposed to give a report. And I was going to have Anthony read that. Anthony's out of town. But I'm also on that committee, so I wanted you to know very briefly the audit committee found that our books are pretty clean. The new CD procedures look pretty good.
What was the process you went through? What was the process you went through to determine that? What was the process of the audit, exactly?
Had a look at the books. I don't know how to describe it any better than that. But I do feel very oppressed by the sense that the one thing I haven't done for you is give you the right to see any financial report thing you guys should be expecting from me. So.
That's not responsible. That's insane. How do you know the money was spent properly? How do the members know that campaign finance law was followed, which we can get hung out to dry on if we don't? Well, we can't. Is it too much trouble to ask that they have an audit committee? Apparently, it is.
One thing I would like people to understand is that I hadn't been a member of the Libertarian Party very long before I was asked officially by, I guess, Richard Burke and Tom Cox to become state treasurer of the party. I'd maybe been volunteering for a few months at most. I think basically what happened was they saw me volunteering on a regular basis and kind of smiled and said, "She'll do." And they said, "We want you to be treasurer." And I thought about it for a little while. But the thing that I wanted them to understand about me, I thought this was really important, that Tom Cox, Richard Burke, and Adam Mayer knew this about me before they chose me to become treasurer for them. I knew enough about myself and about them to know that they probably wouldn't know this unless I told them. So what I did was I took each one of them individually aside before I became treasurer. And I said, you know, it's a great honor that you've asked me to do this for you. It's a lot of responsibility, and I understand that I need to step up to the plate and take on this responsibility. But I said, before I become treasurer, I want you to know this about me. I said, I'm not going to lie for you, and I'm never going to do anything that's illegal or would get the party or myself into trouble. I'm just not going to do it. So if that's okay with you, if that's what you want in me, then let me know and we'll move forward and I'll become treasurer. Well, each one of them individually looked me straight in the face, right in the eye, and said, "Oh, no problem. Of course we're going to do things right." So what I found, of course, immediately upon becoming treasurer, as you know from the letter that that we wrote, I was embroiled in a lie as I was being elected treasurer of the Libertarian Party. Something that it offended me deeply, actually, and I struggled with that from then on. I felt pretty bad about it too. Then the question comes, why didn't you maybe resign right away? Or why didn't you bring it forward publicly? Well, I was really new to the party, and I was very, very idealistic and very excited about the libertarian principles, and also felt the weight of being treasurer deeply. And I wanted to do the best job that I could, and I also didn't want to let party members down. So the way that I chose to handle that was to talk to Tom individually about that incident, and talk to Richard, and then later I began to talk to Adam about violations, things I saw them doing that I really didn't agree with.
In 2004, kind of a very interesting year. The Bend 2004 convention, actually there was a lot of history to that you probably don't know about. After I resigned, I don't know why they did this. They literally took a person who walked off the street into the office and made her treasurer. Her name is Deanna Anderson. I was shocked, and I spoke to the state committee at that point in time that they were extremely foolish for appointing somebody who walked off the street, signed up to be a libertarian that day, to make them treasurer of our party. Clearly, given the immense growth of the party, because when I was first treasurer of the party in the year 2000, we were just pushing a little bit over $2,000 a year, and we had grown in 2003 to about $48,000 a year. That's quite a bit of you just can't take anybody off the street and make them treasurer. But they did. And I had my words, and I was flabbergasted. I suggested that they maybe put something in the newsletter. Maybe they even put out an ad in the Oregonian. You know, maybe they even call up members and try to figure out who could actually deal with this. They didn't do that. They just picked her. And as far as I know, she only showed up to a few meetings, broke her leg, from the last I know, and was never seen from again. So this kind of left to a lot of questions of who was doing the finances, who was doing the treasurer work, and most of all, who was doing the audit. So comes along the March 2004 convention at Bend, and I show up there really kind of wondering what's going on. Well, Tom Cox, to my knowledge, from the stories that I heard, took Teresa DeBellis aside, who was already assisting him in the treasury work, took her aside at the convention and said, "This is your audit convention, or this is your audit committee." And without her even understanding what he said or even having a word to reply, walks into the convention room to give his report. And of course, he gives this thing where he says, "Well, the audit report and everything is fine." And immediately several of us jumped up and said, "Who was on the audit committee?" He couldn't tell us. We asked, "Do you have any paperwork to show us about this audit?" He didn't have any paperwork. We asked, is there a signed statement from the audit committee that verifies that the audit was done? He didn't have that. Several of us were rather angry and a little bit bothered by that fact. Shortly thereafter, I would say maybe a half an hour later, Tom Cox returns to the podium and does admit that an audit was really never done, and that in fact he would pay for it. Okay, so several of us, 4 of us in fact, a few months later approached Adam Mayer, who is he's now the chair, and we say, "Adam, this is a problem. You really need to look into this. I mean, there was no audit committee formed. I mean, you had a period of time there where you had a treasurer who had disappeared on you, and you know, it doesn't look good. We need to really fix this. I mean, I'm concerned because this is my money. We are trusted with this. This is a big thing." And Adam essentially did not want to deal with the situation. In fact, he didn't even want to address it. He basically told me that what a previous state committee does not carry over to the current state committee, and that if I had any problems with it, I need to take it up with Tom Cox.
One day me and Richard were talking about the next convention and what to do about limiting the opposition's presence. Well, that was when he hit upon the idea of having a convention in the middle of nowhere. In this way, he can control the votes and not have to worry about opposition as much.
At the last state committee meeting, 46 petitions were turned in order to recall Adam Mayer. The state committee gave responsibility of the membership list to Richard Burke. When asked how many members there were, Richard Burke couldn't tell the committee at that time. He said he needed until the following Wednesday.
Just a quick question. What are the raw untabulated numbers? In other words, what's the very maximum number of members that we're looking at? We have a list of current members that's obsolete, and then we have a list of new donations, some of which are going to include brand new memberships. What's the total of those two numbers?
I don't know until I process the list, but I can't imagine the number being over 400.
Richard Burke produced a membership list with 272 members with no independent verification, and suddenly 7 of the petitions were no longer valid because the people were not on the membership list who had signed the petition. One of the most notable of this is James Blasek. James Blasek appears a total of 13 times on our C&Es and has been a monthly pledger and a member since 1990, and he now finds himself missing because he signed a petition to recall Adam Mayer.
My name is Dan Wilson. I have been involved with the Libertarian Party since about 1994. And my place in this is, much to my lasting regret and shame, I helped put Adam and Richard where they are. In 1994, the best way to describe the situation was the Libertarian Party was being run by a purist faction, for lack of a better term. Fred Orther, Bruce Knight, Bob Tiernan, anybody who's been around any length of time knows who they are. And the Libertarian Party was going nowhere. And Richard Burke was actually chair at this time. And the purists at least understood that they needed to go somewhere. They may not have understood exactly where, but they understood that much. And so they sent out a survey to 1,000 registered libertarians. Why they didn't go to all the, I think it was 9,000 or 10,000 at this time, that were registered libertarians is a very simple reason. They had a budget, an annual budget in the $2,000 a year range. But nonetheless, they wanted to find out, what could they do better? So the state committee went ahead and approved the survey and then said, okay, Richard, send it out. And he did. But one of the things that was missing that they had very definitely approved and wanted in that was to have the Libertarian Party statement of principles included. This is very important. This is in fact really the foundation of the Libertarian Party. In particular, the parts about not using fraud or initiating force is a big deal. And when this happens, of course, it's intolerable, particularly as a libertarian, because our statement, our principles says we don't do this. Well, Richard felt that this was too strong of a statement for someone new to libertarianism to be hit with. And so he, on his own, didn't do it. He didn't include it. I think at first he claimed it was a mistake, but everyone knew that he did not believe that this was something that should be in what might be the first contact any of these people that they had selected to send these surveys to, the first communication they had ever had from the Libertarian Party. This, I believe, from my own experience, was fundamentally what caused the war between the purist and the more pragmatic faction that actually wanted to win elective office, win legislation, and actually do the politics stuff rather than just endlessly talking about it. The job needed to be done. Coming into this, it occurred to me, well, I kind of like a lot of the purist faction guys, but when it really came down to it, which one was more likely to get me what I wanted, which was personal and economic freedom? So I said, fine, Richard, I'm with you, at least for now. If something better comes along, fine. But his faction seemed to be the only one that seemed to have some understanding of politics. So then we went into the mode of a factional war. And it was a nasty one. You name it, it probably happened. The idea and the strategy that was pursued, and which I believe is still in operation to this day, evolved at this time. The meetings before the meetings of our caucus would happen before state committee meetings, where we would literally plan out our legislative strategy. A couple hours, we'd show up at Richard's and lay out, okay, here's what we were going for, here's how we're going to do it. And some of the other things, the backroom dealing and other things that seem to have become more common, have its genesis there. And the other thing that was part of the strategy that was pursued was to never tell the rank and file too much of what was going on. Because people don't like factional wars to begin with. And we were really having a problem with attrition. Which also meant that there were maybe 5-6 people that tended to be around for long terms. And Richard was one of them. And in fact, Richard ended up doing most of the work simply because he ran his own business. And of course, he was married, so that meant that he had another source of income in his house. So all he had to do for his business was just the minimum to pay whatever bills he felt needed to be paid. And then he spent the rest of his time on politics. This is where he lives. He wants to be that politician, that center of everything. He likes being in front of the audience. And this is the genesis of what we see. So, we go in 1996, we finally win a majority, and everyone is so burnt out that we can't do anything. You see, we gained the majority when one day Ralph Browning, I believe it was, couldn't show up to a state committee meeting. And we weren't about to postpone the state committee meeting. We had things we wanted to do, and if one of the purist faction wasn't there, so much the better. And so Ralph wasn't there, and the gambit that they decided to play was to initiate a recall on our faction of the state committee, in effect putting everything on hold. Well, that started a period that I like to call the recall wars, because that was literally what it evolved into. And so we did it. We kept the rank and file together, didn't tell them too much, arranged everything in the meetings, and the only way the purists felt they could hang on was to do that. Now, if you think about the recall at this time, it was very easy to do. Much easier than it is now, in fact. And it's really something you only do when you have no other recourse. And Richard, in fact, a year or two before, actually wanted to use it against them, and I gamed it out, and eventually we came to the conclusion that there was no consequence of not using the recall that was worse than the known consequences of using it, because everything came to a halt. And this was a very brutal time. Personnel attrition was a problem. And so the only way to stay ahead of the purist faction was to come up with legal ways of excluding as many of them as we could. Raise the dues. They were originally $10 a year. We raised them to $25, and a lot of them complained they couldn't make it, and our attitude was not our problem. And we needed the money, true, but like I said, if it gets rid of some of the opposition, even better. And also, the opposition later, when the recall didn't get us recalled, basically just walked out. They literally created their own state committee. Eventually we won that because we'd managed to document everything well enough that, yes, the state of Oregon and the National Party recognized our faction as having the actual state committee. We'd appointed members from our own faction to fill in, and that was how we won it. But everyone was so burnt out that we just lost it in '96. It was inevitable, and then we went back. It was in this time period that me and Richard had discussed the strategy of using a delegate system as a way to make it harder, or more correctly, and this is probably a better way of putting it, by having a delegate system, it means that in order to get votes, you would actually have to get people in at the lower level. But the real objective was, because we knew they probably wouldn't do that, that it meant that we could then grow our numbers faster and gain control of the state committee and hold it by making things more difficult for them. The difference between this strategy that any other and what any other politician might do is, well, not a lot really. But something had to give. The Libertarian Party by 1994 had reached a point of stagnation. Something had to change. What we were pushing was not a place that the purists really wanted to go. And they had a personal thing about Richard. And a lot of it states from the fact that Richard would tend at this point in time to be overly optimistic and promise way too much. Something that, as I understand, has not really changed, doesn't really surprise me. But he never went into out-and-out falsehood. Never did that. The truth is, it never would have served our ends anyway. So when we get around to 97, 98, we get the major party status. That was really the purpose of major party status, was to make it harder for them to compete in gaining votes at convention. After that, the purists knew that it was over for them. So we get into 99, 2000, the Tom Cox campaign. Now we have a different problem. The recall wars basically ended when me and Adam chose to basically recall them often and use minimal numbers of votes. This is why the recall provisions are so much harder now. And it, in a way, broke the purist faction psychologically, because we had taken their weapon from them and used it to very devastating effect. Since every time we were going to do something or did something they didn't like, they didn't have the votes, this was their recourse. They'd recall us. Well, by that time it was over. And particularly Adam, I believe, in some ways, was emotionally scarred by all this going on. I don't think he liked the disorder and what basically amounted to warfare going on. And so he didn't want this happening again, and he was very determined that it wouldn't happen again. And of course, he felt that Richard was important for the future of the Libertarian Party. Now, Richard has some very useful skills in dealing with public relations, there's no doubt of that. But when it comes to strategy, no. He's a very short-term thinker. So he will do something that will get him what he wants today, but will have very long-term and bad consequences for the future. So you really don't want someone like that planning your strategy. It doesn't work. And when I was running as a treasurer for his campaign for governor, you cannot keep books in the face of Richard. It just can't be done. Because he's going to do what he wants. And the simplest way not to worry about whether or not it's legal is to simply not ask the person who's going to have to face the music if something slips. Me being the person that I am, I won't go along with that. I will not risk myself like that. Furthermore, to allow it just simply gives us a bad name. And I can't go along with that. So we get into this situation, we have the office, literally inherited from the Tom Cox campaign. A little bit needs to be said about that office, I think. That office is a statement of ego. Specifically, Richard and Adams. It's a way of saying to the world, we are here and I am in control. And so the office, and it came, and in fact one of my last conversations with Adam, with him about 3 years ago, I said, look, you have got to put a leash on him. He does things, he doesn't consider the consequences. You can't leave the debit card in his hands because he can't keep his own finances straight. So you can imagine what happens. The treasurer needs ultimate control over those finances. You know you can't do this, that it isn't going to work. And he just said, well, Richard needs the freedom. And then toward the end he said something, and this is fundamentally where things slipped, because I wanted to move on from the faction wars and the recall wars. It was now time to talk to our registered libertarians and try to get them involved. Because you can't run a political party of any weight, of any influence, on 5 people and maybe 10 followers. Doesn't work. It's not an option. And playing off the major parties against each other, yes, that's going to happen in the natural course of business. I don't particularly have a problem with that, but it's certainly not going to be the mainstay of any strategy I devise. Because I'm not concerned with just today, I'm concerned with what's going to happen a year, 2 years, 5 years down the road. Where will we be then? But this was the strategy that Cox, Richard, and Adam have basically decided to pursue. And Adam said to me, well, Richard is indispensable. When he said that, at that point I knew that the Libertarian Party of Oregon was doomed. And it was doomed for a very simple and very obvious reason, which it surprises me that Adam would miss, but nonetheless he did. And it is this. Once you make any one person or any one thing indispensable, then everything else, including the institution, the organization, its members, principles, even its success, automatically becomes dispensable. It is simply not possible to win. Your organization will stagnate, decline, and disappear. That's inevitable. And it became inevitable when Adam made that decision. So here we find ourselves here today, recalling him. Why? Because his sole purpose as chair is to defend Richard. That's it. That's why. No one else will do it, really. I mean, if you think about it, after listening to other people on this tape, you'll see that no one else would really do that. Because everyone else sees, well, I can't do anything because it all has to come from Richard. Why bother? There's no participation. Why should anyone join? Why should anyone do anything if it comes down to one man? There's no reason. And libertarians, nowhere in the statement of principles do I see any reference to the idea of one person being the reason for the Libertarian Party. In fact, it makes no reference to a person. It references individuals. We all have to win something from this. So, that was my part. It seemed like a good idea at the time, and to be honest, I didn't have a lot of good choices to make at that time. You work with the material that you have at hand, and you try to improve the situation. At the point where I really needed Adam to help me solve this problem with Richard, he couldn't bring himself to do it. And at that point, the situation became unrecoverable and untenable. So I left. Keep in mind that this is probably just the barest details of what happened. Whole volumes could be written on it, really to no point. But I believe I have captured the essence of why we're where we're at. Because if we're going to figure out where to go, we first need to know where we've been. And the policy early on in the factional wars was adopted that we should never tell the members the history of what had happened, because a lot of times it would send them running away. And we didn't want to do that. That policy, I believe, has evolved into something more, where you only have a very few people that are told anything at all, and they don't even tell the state committee hardly anything. If anything that the other people that have said so far to me says anything, it says that that policy is still in force, and in fact stronger than it was even in that time period. So, we're at a stagnation point. The LPO, while financially is in somewhat better condition than it was in 1994, is still largely in the condition that it was then. The political activity that was happening during the Cox campaign is not happening now. The only way I know that there's even a Morley for Governor campaign is if I drive past the office and see a banner for it in the office. Yes, I know a lot of people drive by the office, but most of the state does not. I see no evidence that there's a campaign. The only campaign that I see any kind of activity at all for is West Wagner, and you don't see much of it up here because I live in Beaverton, but at least somebody's doing the right thing, and glad to see it. So where do we go from here? How do we break this? Well, it's fairly obvious that we can't do it from within, because everything's sewn up. The reason the major party status, as I indicated before, was adopted was to limit participation, or at least make it difficult. Since that strategy has been pursued and even perfected since those days, you can't possibly win, because they'll just change the rules on you. And yes, we did do that too during the factional wars. Again, it was more about changing the rules and hanging on than actually doing what needed to be done. Now, as a short-term measure to set yourself up for a long-term strategy, okay, I can deal with that. Sometimes things get nasty in politics. I wish it didn't, but it does. It's an imperfect universe. In fact, I think it's a defective universe a lot of times, but that's the situation. But you don't adopt it as a long-term strategy, because you will not win and you will not succeed. Eventually you have to break out of the wartime mentality. So we're going to have to get rid of Adam. We're going to have to get rid of Richard, because Richard will only do the things that are fun to him, and everything else just falls by the wayside. And if it exposes us to legal liability, well, that's not his problem. In fact, Adam had this great vision of surrounding Richard with people that would insulate him from the effects of what he was doing. Now, how anyone is supposed to learn how to do the right thing from that, I will never know. It can't be done. If someone persists in doing foolish things, you cannot protect them from the consequences of it. Indeed, that's the whole point of free market economics. You suffer the consequences of the actions you choose. And at the very least, at least you learn something from it. Well, clearly this hasn't been happening either. Where do we go? We're going to have to change the bylaws. The current set of bylaws evolved from what the purists had originally wrote into something that is really designed to disenfranchise pretty much everybody. So I think we're going to have to start from zero on that one. I don't see any way around it. We have to address that issue. You can't get new members in a political party if they have no chance to actually affect any change, whether within the Libertarian Party of Oregon itself or in the larger world. Cannot happen. So that needs to be changed. The fact that apparently, from what others have said to me, that the decisions are decided, and again this evolves from our pre-meeting state committee meetings of years ago, is that the decisions are already decided before you even have the state committee meetings, which means you have zero transparency whatsoever. Nobody can find out anything, and even if they do, what would be the point? The decision's already been made. By hook or by crook, it doesn't really matter. The decision has already been made. What's the point? It's no wonder no one's interested. And it's no wonder that the number of volunteers that we have in the office has been steadily decreasing. The people that you're watching on this DVD are people that have worked in that office. They're not there anymore. And a lot of them bring a lot of useful skills, things that the Libertarian Party needs. But they won't do anything for the Libertarian Party. Why? Because they will not affect any change as a result. They won't gain anything from it, either recognition or tangible political change. Why do anything when there's no upside for your doing it? There's no point. And therein lies the problem. You can't gain new members if participation is completely and utterly futile and pointless. And this all stems from Adam making that one very fatal decision that one person above all is indispensable. We're going down, guys. Get used to it. Unless the current structure is removed, the current people who evolved that structure are removed, nothing is possible. All we will do is be playing in the margins between the big boys. And we will not actually be able to affect what the Democrats and Republicans do all that much, because we'll be seen as spoilers. Instead of playing our own game and letting them suffer whatever consequences as a result, we're simply saying, well, maybe we can affect them. Maybe we can get the Republicans to do this. Or maybe we can get the Democrats to do something else. Pointless exercise. Say what you're going to say, do what you're going to do, and everything else will follow. But people need to understand that the Libertarian Party stands for something. That it exists for a reason. And that is why the statement of principles is important. It tells us the very things we should not do under any circumstances, which unfortunately I helped with. And, well, like anyone, just as an individual must face his mistakes, so must an organization as a whole face its mistakes. And the current structure and leadership, or lack thereof, I should say, is the Libertarian Party of Oregon's mistake, or major mistake. So as distasteful as this recall is, I don't see any other strategy that's workable. Adam and Richard simply must go. Someone else must run the Libertarian Party of Oregon. It's up to you to decide who that should be. All I can say is choose wisely.